funny point in the year where we know new cards are coming from both AMD and Nvidia, though when exactly, no one truly knows. AMD were keen to show the smallest teaser ever in their Ryzen 7000 announcement, but all that really tells us is that things are close. How close? No one knows. Well, AMD knows, but that's about it. So with this, I guess, uncertain timeline of new cards, people are still clinging on to their trusty old cards from years gone by. And that actually led me on to grabbing some old cards off the shelves and seeing how they fare in 2022, including this little beast, the GTX 1080. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. I wish these files would transfer faster. Come on! Whoa, is that the FireCuda 510 NVMe drive with its blistering fast speeds of 3450 megabytes a second read, 3200 megabytes a second write, and capacities of up to 2 terabyte? I can have these files transferred in no time. And if I'm looking for the ultimate performance, I could even get the 4th generation FireCuda 520. I better check the link in the description to find out more details. So the 10 series of cards in general were amazing. Before Nvidia went all in with ray tracing and focused on pure rasterization performance, this is what we had to deal with. And if anything, and if you've seen our video on the GTX 1070 Ti, I made it clear that the 10 series of cards were kind of ahead of their time. They offered a huge step up in performance from the generation before, as well as efficiency, and lots of people are still actually holding on to them because, well, you know, the latest generation hasn't exactly given them a decent upgrade path, especially with the cost of them being so high due to a multitude of reasons. So the GTX 1080, it came out at the end of May 2016, so it's pushing just over 6 years old at this point, and at $599 in the US or £620 in the UK when it launched, it offered pretty stellar performance from a value for money perspective. And with cards now selling on eBay for around $150 in the US and £160 in the UK, I thought it was time to see how they compare against some of the more expensive cards. Notably, the RTX 3050, which has seen pretty bad press since its inception. So I wanted to see if a card from the past is able to bring it down a peg or two. It's a service we deliver, so you don't end up buying a potato. And yes, I get it, the RTX 3050 has ray tracing. But again, have you seen its ray tracing performance? Yeah, the less said about that, the better, I guess. Another thing that I was interested to see was how things stacked up against the RX 6600, because in today's current climate, that is seen as one of the best value GPUs you can buy right now. So there's definitely a few questions we could ask here today. And it allows us to kind of drill down into other comparisons at a later date in further videos. Now, I've purposely not included the 1080 Ti because I feel while they, will offer better performance overall, there's kind of a lot more questions to ask with that, and it just muddies the point of this video just a little bit. So instead, we'll be making a video focusing on the 1080 Ti because out of all of the GPUs from the last 6 years or so, it's definitely regarded as, at least by myself and probably most of the community, as being one of the best GPUs ever made. In fact, it was so good that we all agree here in the eTeknix offices that it was kind of too good for its time. So definitely make sure you're subscribed for that video in the near future. Now, as always, we threw the GPU into our X570 based test system with the Ryzen 9 5900X, a Zeus Crosshair 8 Dark Hero motherboard, and 32GB of Corsair Dominator Platinum RGB 3600MHz dual channel memory. Due to the age of the cards we tested and the fact that not all of them support it, Smart Access Memory or Resizable Bar have been disabled. And with the level of performance we expected from the cards tested, all games were run on the medium preset, or medium settings when presets weren't available. Also, we ran tests in around 20 titles and we'll be looking at a selection of them today, along with game averages across all of the titles. As always, if you want to see data from all of the titles tested, then we'll be posting up all of them for every game up on our Patreon, where you'll get a ton of other benefits, including exclusive behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, and access to our super secret special area on Discord. The link for that is down below. That aside, let's get into it and see how the GTX 1080 does. Starting with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where we see the GTX 1080 come in a respectable third place out of all the cards we tested today, placing it above the likes of the RTX 3050 and the RX 6500 XT. It's still able to hold up against the other cards with an average FPS of 89, seeing it only 11 FPS below the RX 6600, which sits at the top of the stack. As we move over to Call of Duty Warzone, we see the GTX 1080 now overtake the RX 5600 XT for second place. The average FPS has increased by 11 now, sitting at 100 frames per second, but so has the RX 6600, leaving the GTX 1080 still following behind. Other 10 series cards seem to also be climbing up the chart, with the GTX 1066GB matching the RX 6500 XT at 66 FPS, though with slightly higher 1% lows. In CSGO, with the FPS cap from the source engine removed, we see the GTX 1080 actually taking first place with a whopping 748 FPS on average, which places it a whole 78 FPS above the second place card, being the similarly old 1070 Ti. There isn't as much of a difference between the 1% lows, however the GTX 1080 still sits higher at 326. The newest cards trickle down below this, showing that for CSGO, the 10 series is still king. Cyberpunk 2077, being as demanding as it is, showed the GTX 1080 drop down to 4th. It sits just below the RTX 3050 with an average FPS difference of 3, however is a whopping 1 FPS higher in the 1% lows. The RX 6600 takes the cake in this title and sits at the top with an average of 76 FPS, showing that newer cards are able to handle this game just a little bit better. Dying Light 2 was another win for the GTX 1080, seeing it sitting in second place above most of the other cards at 69 FPS. The 1% lows followed slightly behind at 61, showing that this game is very well optimised and the likes of the 1080 is more than man enough to play it. The RX 6600, however, flies ahead with 84 FPS and a 1% low that sits higher than the average of the GTX 1080. Moving on to Far Cry 6, we see the GTX 1080 sitting above the RTX 3050 with an average FPS of 99. The RX 6600 still towers above it at 129 FPS, but what's interesting here is how the 5600 XT starts fighting back with some pretty solid numbers. That aside though, we still see the RTX 3050 below the 1080 and sitting above the 1070 Ti, with what could be argued a margin of error win. The GTX 1080 showed an average FPS of 149 in Gears 5, leaving it at the top over all the other cards tested. Although the GTX 1080 was 6 FPS higher than the RX 5600 XT, the GTX 1080 was 3% lower in the 1% lows, but at such a small difference and at such a high frame rate, it's not something you're ever going to notice anyway. In Halo Infinite, we see the GTX 1080 fighting closely behind the RX 6600 for first place, with an average FPS difference of 3 FPS between the two cards. The 1% lows also showed similarities with only 2 FPS separating them, and the 5600 XT, RTX 3050 and GTX 1070 Ti all came in with very close results, vying for that third spot. Horizon Zero Dawn showed the GTX 1080 winning the fight against the RX 6600 and taking first place with an average FPS of 139. Although it sits above all the other cards tested in the average FPS, the 1% lows are actually lower than that of the RX 6600, 5600 XT, and only just above the RTX 3050. Again, at such a high FPS, you're unlikely to notice these lows, but does go to show how the game is more optimised for newer GPUs. In Resident Evil Village, we can see the GTX 1080 sitting at a solid 164 FPS average at 1080p, although that still isn't enough to get it above the RX 6600, which storms past every card we tested with a huge 231 FPS on average. The GTX 1080 does however sit comfortably above the RTX 3050 and other newer generation cards, and isn't actually that far behind the RX 5600 XT. Moving on to The Witcher 3, where the GTX 1080 comes out on top with an average FPS of 186 over the RX 6600's average of 175 FPS. The big thing here was in the 1% lows, where we don't see as much of a difference as the top 3 cards all come in around the same at 123 to 124 FPS. Finally, in the ever so optimised Rainbow Six Siege, we see the GTX 1080 yet again come in below the RX 6600. However, in this title, that can be forgiven, with the GTX 1080 showing an average FPS of 305 on the medium preset, and the RX 6600 at 334 FPS. While the 1080 didn't win, shall we say, at 305 FPS, I definitely wouldn't be disappointed, would you? So as always, lots to discuss when looking at the 12 games that you've seen today. Though we did test a lot more games, and as mentioned, you can see this direct data over on our Patreon. The link for that is down below. Now what this does let us do, however, is to calculate the overall average performance of the GTX 1080 and kind of see how it's positioned to the other cards across all of the games. And what we found here was actually extremely interesting. Now, while the RX 6600 came out on top, it was only actually by 1 whole FPS on average, and only 7 FPS ahead in the 1% lows. But it's not as clear cut as kind of what you think. Now, the RX 6600 did beat the GTX 1080 in most tests, but with CSGO seeing such a huge leap in performance in favour of the 1080, it allowed the average FPS overall to become a little bit skewed. Now, if we actually take out the results for CSGO and re-look at the averages, that's when things get really interesting, as we see the RX 6600 pull out in front at 151 FPS compared to the 138 FPS on the GTX 1080, which is now kind of nigh on identical to the overall performance of the 5600 XT. One game did that, one game kind of skewed it all. Now, even with this now kind of falling slightly behind the RX 6600, it doesn't take away from what we actually saw here today. A 6-year-old GPU keeping up in 2022, which is what I set out to do. I wanted to see if it was still beefy enough to take on these young guns, and I wanted to make a few distinct comparisons. The first being with the RTX 3050, which I think is clear to see that the overall average FPS just doesn't cut the mustard right now for a card that is more expensive and offers less performance over a product from yesteryear. It was a poor product when it launched at a time when prices were much higher, and the GTX 1080 has just shown that Nvidia, AIBs and retail partners all may need to re-look at it and address that, a hefty price cut is very much needed in order to compete. And again, I know it's an RTX card and it has ray tracing, but the performance kind of suffers so much when you look at enabling it that you need the likes of DLSS or FSR to make up for it. While a card like the GTX 1080, while not having ray tracing as a feature, still holds its own in performance and pushes above the RTX 3050. Now the other card was the RX 6600, which is newer and does cost more money, but is highly regarded as the kind of value for money king right now. But if you're rocking an older GTX 1080, I think it's clear to see that the RX 6600 is more of a sidestep than a full-on upgrade. And the likes of an RX 6700 may actually be better suited, depending on the price. Now either way, I'm kind of blown away with what we've actually seen here today. And again, it kind of comes as no surprise that the 10 series are still amazing for what they are. Just like the 1070 Ti. They offer up amazing performance, even in 2022. And are, at this point, still worth holding on to if you have one. And that's kind of even more evident when we look at the cost per frame, where the GTX 1080 now takes our top spot in the US as being the best value GPU you can buy right now, out of all the cards we tested, followed closely by the slightly lower end 1060 cards. In the UK, it's a similar story, with a few pennies between the GTX 1063GB and the 1080, but at less than £1 per frame, it's a clear winner. What I'm trying to say is that in terms of the value side of things, the GTX 1080 is now firmly positioned as one of the best value for money GPUs you can buy right now, albeit on the used market. But if that doesn't bother you, then there are some deals to be had in both the UK and the US. So the big question is, what should we look at next? A 1080 Ti, or should we switch our focus over to AMD and maybe see how Vega 64 has aged after all this time? There's definitely some interesting talking points to be had, because while the 10 series have aged extremely well, almost like a mid-range bottle of Merlot, I feel AMD may not have the same luck. Either way, it's going to be interesting to see. So let me know in the comments section what you want to see next. Like I always say, we can, run tests like this all day, every day, and we do. And it's still great to see that consumers do have choice. It may just mean taking a small risk and buying used instead. But for those who already have the cards, like a GTX 1080, hopefully it's maybe, giving you an idea about whether it's worth sticking with what you have or moving up to something else. That aside, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, then a like and a sub to the channel would be absolutely fantastic. And if you love what we do, consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you get a ton of benefits and of course, the rest of that testing data and benchmarks. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. See you later guys. Bye bye.